finally, before I go to bed, I'm going to talk to you a little about Gorbachev, who, when he became leader of the Soviet Union, said a couple of things. We know about glasnost, openness, people are going to be allowed to say more things, and there's going to be honest discussions about how to move forward. And he also talked about perestroika, which was restructuring the economy and politics to make it a bit more suitable to the modern world. But he also said another thing when we're talking about the end of the Cold War and causes. He said this: we want to stop and not to don't do this again, Anna. We want to stop and not to continue the arms race, and consequently propose to freeze nuclear arsenals and stop further deployment of missiles. So he says, we'll stop the arms race, totally stop it. And this is the start of a new era. It's a complete change from everything that had gone before in the Soviet Union. To make something very clear, Gorbachev wanted to end the Cold War, but he didn't want to see the destruction of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. That was a byproduct that came with his ideas. And the two separate things. The end of the Cold War is different to the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the East. The Cold War was the cold conflict between the West and the East, which he ended. Anyway, I'm labouring a point. One of Gorbachev's ministers confessed at one point that as much as 50% of the Soviet gross national product, so 50% of basically everything the Soviet Union had, went on defence. That's absolutely balmy. Because of Gorbachev and glasnost, the Soviet media on the television showed what was actually going on in Afghanistan, and the Soviets, well, the unpopularity and the soldiers dying and so on and so forth. So the media began to call for the end of the war in Afghanistan, all because of Gorbachev's glasnost. Before this, it was all covered up and it was all success. A big problem with glasnost as well was, there's a phrase here, nomenclature, which you need to ask me about in the lesson to spell for you. Nomenclature are the people in the Soviet states, or in Eastern Europe generally, in communist states, who were the privileged few, who got luxuries, got cars, got maids and staff for the house and huge mansions. There's a small minority, they're the ones with the power, and they quite like keeping power. And they did it on the backs of all the poor people who didn't get half of that stuff, or even a tenth of it. And because of glasnost, this started to get reported in the newspapers, how there's these people in charge of the Soviet Union and people in charge of Poland and Hungary and Romania who were driving around in chauffeur-driven limos, and they had maids and mansions and all of this, which is ridiculous because communism's all supposed to be about being equal. So glasnost opened up, well, this ridiculous situation to people, which helped to discredit communism still further, all because of glasnost. Glasnost also allowed Soviet people things like access to Western music, religious freedom. Corrupt Soviet officials were even put on trial, like Brezhnev's son-in-law. Brezhnev, long dead by then, of course, but his own son-in-law put on trial. But one side effect of this was in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, nationalism was awoken. They started to clamour to be able to look after their own affairs. Perestroika was something he was keen on as well, as we know, and he chose 1988 and the General Assembly of the United Nations to make an astonishing point where he said where he urged that there should be freedom of choice for all, and that the Soviet satellites were free to choose their own paths. Not only did he say that the Eastern European people were free to choose their own paths, at the same time, at the United Nations, in a speech in 1988, he said he was going to remove 10,000 tanks, 8,500 artillery pieces, 800 combat aircraft, and 500,000 Soviet troops from Eastern Europe. In other words, he basically left the leaders of the Eastern European communist countries to themselves. There was not going to be Soviet intervention anymore. He'd specifically told them this as well. He said, you cannot rely on us to come in and bail you out and prop you up. The people need to be able to choose for themselves. And the people didn't want to be communist, as we see in Poland and Solidarity. So what had kept Eastern Europe under Soviet control in the first place after the Second War was Soviet military force. They had kept it in place. When you think of Prague Spring, Hungarian uprising, Berlin, and so on, it was military force that kept that all communist and all under the Soviet sphere of influence. And Gorbachev is taking that away in 1988 in an announcement at the United Nations. 1988, United Nations, write it down. Now that speech at the United Nations took place 1988. I don't know if I mentioned that, and you should write that down. It was also in December 1988. So in January 1989, the first cracks in Eastern Europe started to appear, and the first place it happened was Hungary, where the parliament voted to allow freedom of association and assembly. In other words, they were going to allow other political parties than the Communist Party and eventually an actual election. As they were preparing for an election, they also decided that they would break down the barrier that had been between Hungary and Austria, and all of the wire was cut down, and people from the East, well, they were allowed to go on holiday in other communist countries. So, for example, lots of East Germans went on holiday to Hungary that year and never came back to the houses because they just went straight over the border to Austria, straight to West Germany, and started to create their new lives in the capitalist West. But Gorbachev did nothing. He actually expressed support for the reforms in Hungary. In Poland, the government and the Polish communist leader agreed to talks with the Solidarity leader, Walesa. And that's after Solidarity had been banned for 7 years from everything we talk about in the Pope and Solidarity podcast. And they negotiated and agreed elections would take place in June. So Hungary things start to kick off, Poland things start to kick off, and all of this after that 1988 December the 7th speech at the United Nations where Gorbachev said the Eastern European people are free to choose for themselves. In March 1989 there were even free elections in the Soviet Union. Now Gorbachev managed to maintain his position as president of the Soviet Union, but for the first time there were people who were not communist who were part of the government. This is where it starts to fall apart for the Soviet Union. This is all perestroika, this restructuring, allowing votes. In June, in Poland, Solidarity absolutely swept the boards in the elections, and Solidarity and Walesa, well, they took control of Poland. All coming as a result of Gorbachev clearly saying, we're not going to step in if you decide for yourself how your futures would be. Eastern European communist leaders, you're on your own. There's much more to tell you about Gorbachev, but I'm very tired, so we'll pop that in another podcast at another time.